Grandma's hearing is going, my daughter-in-law whispered to my son. We need to discuss this with the lawyer before she catches on. Little did they know, my hearing was perfect. I heard every single word they said during that phone call, including the part about my inheritance and their plans to have me declared incompetent. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chen, though everyone calls me Maggie, and I was 73 years old when I discovered that pretending to have hearing loss was the best decision I'd ever made. Not intentionally, mind you. It started as a misunderstanding that spiraled into something much more revealing than I could have ever imagined. I live in a modest ranch house in Tacoma, Washington, just 20 minutes from where my son David and his wife Amanda built their dream home 3 years ago. After my husband Robert passed away from cancer, I thought moving closer to family would bring us together. I sold the 4-bedroom house where I'd raised David and his sister Claire, downsized to something manageable, and settled into what I believed would be my golden years surrounded by the people I loved most. For 42 years, I worked as a dental hygienist at the same practice in downtown Seattle. I was the kind of employee who never called in sick, who remembered every patient's name and their children's birthdays, who stayed late to help with emergency appointments. When I retired 5 years ago, the entire office threw me a party. Patients sent cards. Some even cried. I had built a life around caring for others, around being reliable, around being needed. Retirement suited me well. Initially, I joined a book club, started volunteering at the animal shelter, and took up watercolor painting. My days had structure and purpose. David would call twice a week, Amanda would send photos of their 2 children, Emma and Jake, and I felt connected to their lives without being intrusive. I babysat when they needed date nights, brought homemade soup when someone was sick, and never overstayed my welcome. The hearing issue began innocently enough during a family barbecue last spring. The kids were running around the backyard, music was playing from their outdoor speakers, and multiple conversations were happening simultaneously. When Amanda called my name from across the patio, I didn't hear her the first time. She had to wave and call again before I looked up from the book I was reading. Everything okay, Maggie? She asked, though her tone carried something sharper than concern. Oh yes, dear. Just got absorbed in this mystery novel, I replied, holding up the paperback. Later that evening, as I was helping clear dishes, I noticed Amanda whispering something to David by the kitchen sink. They both glanced at me, and Amanda's expression looked troubled. When I asked if they needed help with anything, David just smiled and said they had everything under control. Over the following weeks, I noticed subtle changes in how they interacted with me. They spoke slightly louder when addressing me directly. Amanda would repeat things she'd just said, even when I'd clearly heard and responded appropriately the first time. During family dinners, if I didn't immediately react to something someone said from another room, I'd catch them exchanging those looks again. The truth was, my hearing was perfectly fine. I'd had it tested during my annual physical just 6 months earlier, and Dr. Martinez had commented on how remarkable it was for someone my age. But I began to realize that my family had latched onto this idea that I was developing hearing problems, and they seemed to be building a case for it with every normal moment of not catching every word in a noisy environment. What started as their misconception became my inadvertent strategy. If they wanted to believe I was going deaf, I found myself unconsciously playing into it. Not maliciously, but in small ways. I'd ask them to repeat something occasionally, even when I'd heard it clearly. I'd turn the television up a little louder when they visited. I'd lean in closer during conversations, as if straining to catch every word. I told myself I was just avoiding the awkwardness of correcting their assumption. It seemed easier to let them think what they wanted to think rather than make them feel foolish for jumping to conclusions. Besides, it wasn't hurting anyone, and it gave them something to feel helpful about. Amanda started speaking more clearly and directly to me, which I actually appreciated. David began looking at me when he spoke instead of calling out from other rooms. But what I didn't realize was how this small deception would reveal something much larger and more troubling about the people I trusted most. The first real warning sign came during Emma's 8th birthday party 2 months ago. I was sitting in their living room, supposedly reading a magazine but actually listening to Amanda on the phone with her sister in the kitchen. She was speaking in hushed tones, but their house has thin walls and I've always had excellent hearing. I'm really worried about David's mom, Amanda was saying. Her hearing is getting worse, and I don't think she realizes how bad it is. Yesterday, she didn't hear the smoke alarm when I burned the cookies, and she was sitting right there in the kitchen. I remembered that moment clearly. The smoke alarm had beeped twice very briefly before Amanda shut it off. I had heard it, but it stopped so quickly that I didn't think it warranted a reaction. Apparently, my lack of jumping up an alarm had been interpreted as deafness. David thinks we should start looking into options, Amanda continued. You know, assisted living places that specialize in seniors with hearing impairments. She's so independent now, but what happens when it gets worse? My stomach dropped. Assisted living? I was 73, not 93. I lived independently, drove safely, managed my finances, maintained my home, and had an active social life. The idea that they were discussing my future living arrangements based on their incorrect assumption about my hearing felt like a betrayal. That night, I lay awake thinking about all the small moments that had led to this. Every time I'd asked them to repeat something, every time I'd leaned in closer, every time I'd turned up the volume on the television. They'd been collecting evidence for a case I didn't even know was being built against my competence. I started paying closer attention to their conversations, both the ones directed at me and the ones they thought I couldn't hear. Amanda had begun speaking to me the way people speak to elderly relatives in nursing homes, with exaggerated patience and simplified vocabulary. David had started handling things for me that I'd never asked for help with, like calling my insurance company to ask questions about my coverage or offering to drive me to appointments I was perfectly capable of getting to myself. The most unsettling part was how they'd begun talking about me in the third person while I was in the room, as if my supposed hearing loss made me invisible. During dinner at their house last month, I heard Amanda tell David, we should probably take her to get her hearing tested officially. She'll need documentation for when we start looking at care facilities. I was sitting not 10 feet away, supposedly focused on helping Jake with his homework, but I heard every word. They were planning my future as if I had no say in it, based on a medical condition I didn't even have. That's when I made a conscious decision to continue the charade, but for different reasons. If they wanted to believe I couldn't hear them, then I would use that assumption to my advantage. I needed to know exactly what they were planning and why they seemed so eager to move me into assisted living when I was perfectly capable of caring for myself. The conversations I overheard over the next few weeks painted a picture I hadn't expected. It wasn't just about concern for my well-being. There were discussions about the value of my house, about my savings account, about the life insurance policy. Robert had left me. Amanda mentioned more than once how much easier it would be to handle everything if I were in a place where professionals could keep an eye on things. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I began to understand that my supposed hearing loss was becoming a convenient excuse for something much more calculated. They weren't just worried about my health, they were positioning themselves to take control of my assets under the guise of caring for someone who could no longer care for herself. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago during what I now think of as the lawyer conversation. I was visiting their house for Sunday dinner, as had become our routine. After we ate, I settled into the living room with a cup of tea and the crossword puzzle, while David and Amanda cleaned up in the kitchen. Their voices carried clearly through the house, and what I heard changed everything. I called the lawyer today, David said, his voice low but not low enough. He said we'll need medical documentation of her condition before we can move forward with any kind of guardianship proceedings. How hard will that be to get? Amanda asked. I mean, it's obvious to anyone who spends time with her that her hearing is going. He said we'll need an official diagnosis, probably from a specialist. And we'll need to document incidents where her hearing problems have put her at risk or made her unable to manage her affairs properly. I sat perfectly still, my pen frozen. Over the crossword, my heart pounding so hard I was afraid they might hear it. What kind of incidents? Amanda pressed. Like not hearing important phone calls, missing safety warnings, not being able to follow conversations about her finances. The lawyer said if we can establish a pattern of cognitive decline related to her hearing loss, it'll be easier to get a judge to grant us conservatorship. And then we can sell her house and move her somewhere more appropriate, Amanda added. That property is worth at least $400,000 now. It seems wasteful for her to be living there alone when she could be in a nice facility. And we could be investing that money for her future care. I felt physically sick. They weren't just planning to have me declared incompetent based on a hearing problem I didn't have, they were actively strategizing how to use false medical claims to gain control of my assets. This wasn't concern for my well-being. This was financial opportunism disguised as family care. The lawyer said the key is documentation, David continued. We need to start keeping a record of every time she doesn't hear something important. Every time she seems confused about what's being said, every time her hearing issues interfere with normal activities. I can do that, Amanda said. I'll start writing things down. And maybe we should start including her less in conversations about important family matters. You know, to protect her from stress, but also to establish that she's not really able to participate in decision-making anymore. They were planning to isolate me from family decisions while simultaneously building a case that I was too impaired to make decisions for myself. The manipulation was breathtaking in its calculated cruelty. As I sat there in their living room, pretending to work on my crossword puzzle while they planned my financial and personal future based on a lie, I realized that my accidental deception had revealed something true and terrifying about the people I'd trusted most. They were willing to fabricate a medical condition, manipulate legal proceedings, and strip me of my independence for their own financial gain. But they had made one crucial mistake. They assumed that my supposed hearing loss meant I couldn't hear them plotting against me. They had underestimated the very person they were trying to manipulate, and in doing so, they had given me the most valuable thing possible, information about their true intentions. I finished my crossword puzzle that evening with steady hands and a clear mind. I thanked them for dinner, kissed my grandchildren goodnight, and drove home in silence. Once I was safely in my own house, I sat down at my kitchen table and started making my own list. Not a list of my supposed hearing problems, but a list of everything I'd overheard, everyone I needed to contact, and every step I needed to take to protect myself from the people who claimed to love me. They thought my hearing was going, but I had heard enough to know exactly what I was up against. And unlike them, I had no intention of building my strategy on lies. The week following my discovery of their lawyer conversation, I watched my son and daughter-in-law with new eyes. Every interaction became a performance I needed to study, every word they spoke carried hidden meaning, and every gesture felt calculated. I continued my routine of visiting twice a week and babysitting Emma and Jake when needed, but now I was gathering intelligence rather than simply spending time with family. David called me Tuesday morning, his voice carrying that artificially cheerful tone he'd developed recently when speaking to me. "Hey Mom, how are you feeling today? Any problems with your ears?" The question struck me as odd. He'd never asked about my ears specifically before, always just a general, "How are you feeling?" Now he was fishing for symptoms, looking for material to add to whatever documentation file Amanda was building. "Oh, I'm fine, sweetheart," I replied, deliberately adding a slight hesitation. "Why do you ask?" "Just checking. Amanda mentioned you seemed to have trouble hearing the phone when she called yesterday." I remembered that call perfectly. Amanda had called while I was in the garden watering my tomatoes. I'd heard the phone ring inside the house but had decided to let it go to voicemail since my hands were dirty and I was in the middle of a task. When I called her back 20 minutes later, she'd seemed annoyed that I hadn't answered immediately. Now I understood why. I was outside working in the garden. I explained. I heard it ring but couldn't get to it in time. There was a pause on David's end, and I could practically hear him making mental notes. Right. Of course. Well, maybe we should look into getting you a cordless phone you can carry outside. You know, just to be safe. The concern felt manufactured, like he was reading from a script titled, "How to Care for Your Hearing Impaired Mother." I agreed to consider the cordless phone idea, knowing full well that my current phone system worked perfectly fine for someone who could actually hear. That afternoon, I decided to visit my neighbor Dorothy Walsh, who lived 2 houses down. Dorothy was 81 and sharp as a tack, with the kind of observational skills that came from decades of teaching high school English. More importantly, she'd lived on our street for 30 years and had watched David grow up. If anyone would give me honest perspective on the situation, it would be Dorothy. I found her in her front yard, deadheading her roses with the precision of a surgeon. Dorothy had always been meticulous about her garden, and at 81, she moved with more purpose and energy than people half her age. "Maggie," she called out when she saw me approaching. Perfect timing. "I just made a pitcher of iced tea, and I've been meaning to ask you something." We settled on her screened porch, glasses of sweet tea sweating in the afternoon heat. Dorothy's directness had always been one of her most appealing qualities, so I wasn't surprised when she cut straight to what was on her mind. "I've been watching your family dynamics lately," she said, adjusting her reading glasses. "That daughter-in-law of yours has been asking some interesting questions around the neighborhood." My stomach tightened. "What kind of questions?" "Questions about your daily routine. Whether you seem confused or forgetful. Whether any of us have noticed you having trouble hearing. She stopped by last week while you were at the grocery store and wanted to know if I'd observed any concerning changes in your behavior." I set down my tea glass carefully, trying to process this information. Amanda had been conducting what amounted to a neighborhood investigation, gathering testimony about my supposed decline from people who barely knew me well enough to make such assessments. "What did you tell her?" I asked. Dorothy snorted. "I told her you seemed as sharp and capable as ever, and that if she was worried about your hearing, maybe she should suggest you see a doctor instead of polling the neighbors." She didn't like that answer much. "Did she say why she was asking?" "Claimed she was just concerned about your safety living alone." "But Maggie, I've been around long enough to recognize when someone is building a case rather than expressing genuine concern. The way she was asking questions, taking notes on her phone, following up with specific examples, it felt more like a legal deposition than a worried family member seeking advice. Dorothy leaned forward in her chair, her expression growing more serious. There's something else. My grandson works at that law firm downtown, Palmer and Associates. He mentioned they've had several consultations recently about elderly care issues and asset protection. I wouldn't normally make connections, but when Amanda started her questioning campaign around the same time, she didn't need to finish the sentence. The timeline was becoming clear. Amanda's neighborhood investigation wasn't random concern. It was evidence gathering for whatever legal action they were planning. Have you noticed any problems with your hearing? Dorothy asked directly. I looked at this woman who'd been my neighbor for years, who'd brought me casseroles after Robert's funeral, who'd never treated me as anything less than fully competent, and I made a decision. My hearing is perfect, I said quietly. But they don't know that. Dorothy's eyebrows shot up, and I saw understanding dawn across her face. Oh my. How long has this been going on? I told her everything. The initial misunderstanding at the barbecue, my unconscious playing into their assumptions, the gradual escalation of their concern, and finally, the overheard conversation about lawyers and guardianship proceedings. Dorothy listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking her head or making small sounds of disbelief. So they're planning to have you declared incompetent based on a hearing problem you don't actually have, she summarized when I finished. And they're actively gathering false evidence to support their case. That's exactly what they're doing. And I have no idea how to stop them without revealing that I've been essentially lying about my hearing for months. Dorothy was quiet. For several minutes, her teacher's mind clearly working through the complexities of the situation. Finally, she spoke. You know, Maggie, sometimes the truth isn't about confessing to a small deception. Sometimes it's about exposing a much larger one. Your family is planning to commit what amounts to fraud against you. Your little performance about hearing loss is nothing compared to what they're attempting. She was right, but knowing that didn't solve my immediate problem. If I suddenly revealed that my hearing was fine, it would be my word against their documented evidence of decline. They could easily claim that I was having good days and bad days, or that I was in denial about my condition. I think you need professional help, Dorothy continued. Legal help. And medical help. You need documentation that your hearing and cognitive abilities are normal, and you need to know exactly what your rights are before they make their next move. The next morning, I called Dr. Martinez's office and scheduled a comprehensive hearing test. I told his nurse that I needed detailed documentation of my hearing ability for personal reasons, and she was happy to accommodate the request. The appointment was scheduled for the following week. That same day, I made another call to Richard Hoffman, a lawyer I'd met through the book club. Richard specialized in elder law and had given a presentation to our group about protecting seniors from financial abuse. At the time, I'd thought his talk was interesting but not personally relevant. Now, his expertise felt like a lifeline. Richard agreed to meet with me that Friday afternoon. His office was in downtown Tacoma, in one of those older buildings with high ceilings and real wood paneling that suggested both competence and permanence. Richard himself was probably in his early 50s, with graying hair and the kind of calm demeanor that immediately put people at ease. I told him everything, just as I had with Dorothy. The false hearing loss assumption, the overheard conversations about guardianship, Amanda's neighborhood investigation, and my growing certainty that they were planning to use fabricated medical evidence to gain control of my finances. Richard took notes throughout my story, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, specific conversations, and the timeline of events. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. Mrs. Chen, what you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon. Adult children sometimes convince themselves that taking control of a parent's assets is in the parent's best interest, even when that parent is fully capable of managing their own affairs. The fact that they're building their case on a medical condition you don't actually have makes this particularly problematic. Can they actually succeed in having me declared incompetent based on false evidence? It's possible, especially if they're the only voices presenting evidence to a judge. Guardianship proceedings rely heavily on family testimony about a person's declining abilities. If David and Amanda present a consistent story about your hearing loss affecting your decision-making capacity, and if they can produce witnesses who support their claims, a judge might grant them conservatorship. The reality of my situation hit me like a cold wave. My own son was prepared to lie in court to take away my legal rights, and he might actually succeed. However, Richard continued, the fact that you're aware of their plan gives you significant advantages. We can document your actual mental and physical competence, gather evidence of their fraudulent behavior, and present a counter-narrative that exposes their true motivations. What would that involve? First, we need medical documentation. Get that hearing test, but also get a comprehensive cognitive assessment. We want clear evidence that you're fully competent to manage your affairs. Second, we need to document their attempts to manipulate the situation. Do you have any written evidence of their conversations about your supposed hearing loss? I shook my head. Everything I'd overheard had been verbal. That's okay. Going forward, you might consider recording conversations where they discuss your condition or their plans. Washington is a two-party consent state for recording, but there are exceptions when someone is protecting themselves from fraud or abuse. Richard spent another hour explaining my legal options and the steps we could take to protect my assets and autonomy. By the time I left his office, I had a clear action plan and, for the first time in weeks, a sense that I wasn't completely powerless against my family's schemes. The hearing test the following Tuesday confirmed what I already knew. Dr. Martinez's audiologist, a young woman named Sarah Kim, put me through a comprehensive battery of tests. My hearing was not only normal for my age, it was actually above average across all frequency ranges. Mrs. Chen, your hearing is excellent, Sarah told me as she reviewed the results. In fact, you have better hearing than most people 20 years younger. Was there a specific concern that prompted this test? I explained that I needed documentation for legal purposes, without going into the family drama. Sarah was happy to provide a detailed written report of my results, along with her professional opinion that I showed no signs of hearing impairment or cognitive decline related to auditory processing. Armed with this medical evidence, I felt more confident about confronting whatever my family was planning. But first, I needed more information about their specific timeline and strategy. The opportunity came the following Sunday during our regular family dinner. I arrived at David and Amanda's house with a pan of my famous lasagna and my usual bright smile, but this time I was also carrying a small digital recorder in my cardigan pocket. Richard had assured me that recording conversations in my own defense was legally permissible, especially when those conversations involved potential fraud against me. Dinner proceeded normally, with Emma and Jake chattering about school activities, and Amanda discussing her latest work projects. I participated in the conversation naturally, occasionally asking people to repeat things just loudly enough that David and Amanda would notice. Their exchanges of meaningful glances confirmed that they were still building their case. After dinner, while I was helping Emma with a school project in the living room, I heard David and Amanda talking quietly in the kitchen. Their voices carried clearly to where I sat, and I discreetly activated the recorder. The neighbor thing was smart, David was saying. Dorothy Walsh is respected in the community. If she'd backed up our concerns about Mom's hearing, it would have carried weight. She wasn't very cooperative, Amanda replied, irritation clear in her voice. She basically told me to mind my own business. But I got good information from the Johnsons and the Patel family. They both said they'd noticed Mom seeming confused during neighborhood conversations. I nearly laughed out loud. The Johnsons barely spoke to me beyond polite greetings, and I'd had maybe 3 conversations with the Patels in the 2 years since they'd moved in. The idea that either family could provide meaningful testimony about my cognitive abilities was absurd, but apparently Amanda had convinced them to support her narrative. What did the lawyer say about next steps? David asked. He wants us to schedule a family meeting with Mom present, where we express our concerns about her living alone. He said if we can get her to agree to some kind of assistance or evaluation on her own, it'll make the legal process much smoother. And if she doesn't agree? Then we move forward with the guardianship petition. He's confident we have enough evidence, especially with the medical documentation we're going to get. I felt a chill run down my spine. Medical documentation. They were going to get. Not documentation of an actual condition, but fabricated evidence to support their false claims. How do we get medical documentation if she won't cooperate with an evaluation? David asked. Dr. Martinez has been her physician for years. If we approach him with our concerns about her hearing loss and its impact on her safety, he might be willing to provide a preliminary assessment based on our observations. The lawyer said family testimony about behavioral changes is often enough for an initial diagnosis, especially in elderly patients. They were planning to manipulate my own doctor into providing false medical evidence. The scope of their deception was breathtaking. They weren't just lying about my condition, they were actively recruiting others to participate in their fraud. The recorder captured every word of their 20-minute conversation, including specific details about their legal strategy, their timeline for action, and their plans to involve my doctor in their scheme. By the time they finished talking and moved back to the living room, I had everything I needed to expose their entire operation. I spent the rest of the evening acting normally, helping with homework, chatting about upcoming family events, and playing the role of the slightly hearing-impaired grandmother they expected me to be. But inside, I was calculating my next moves with the clarity and determination of someone who finally understood exactly what she was fighting against. When I got home that night, I transcribed the recording and emailed both the audio file and transcript to Richard Hoffman. Then I sat in my kitchen, drinking chamomile tea and planning my counterattack. My family thought they were manipulating a vulnerable old woman who couldn't hear well enough to protect herself. They had no idea they were actually dealing with someone who had heard every word of their betrayal and was prepared to use their own words against them. The game had changed, but they didn't know it yet. And I intended to keep it that way until I was ready to reveal exactly how much I had been hearing all along. The phone call came on a Wednesday morning while I was transplanting seedlings in my greenhouse. When I saw David's name on the caller ID, my heart rate quickened slightly. Since I'd started recording their conversations, every interaction felt loaded with hidden meaning. "Hi Mom, I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time," he said, his voice carrying that overly solicitous tone I'd grown to recognize. "Not at all, sweetheart. I was just puttering around in the garden. What's on your mind?" "Well, Amanda and I have been talking, and we think it might be a good idea for all of us to sit down together this weekend. You know, just to catch up and discuss some family matters." The family meeting. Just as I'd heard them planning in my recorded conversation, I felt a strange mix of anxiety and anticipation, knowing this was likely the opening move in their legal strategy. "That sounds lovely," I replied, making sure to add a slight questioning tone. "Is everything all right? You sound a bit serious." "Everything's fine, Mom. We just want to make sure you're getting all the support you need as you get older. You know how much we care about you." The patronizing undertone made my skin crawl, but I maintained my pleasant demeanor. "Of course, dear. Should I bring anything? Maybe that apple crisp you like?" "Don't worry about bringing anything. Just yourself. How about Saturday afternoon around 2? I agreed to the meeting, knowing full well what they had planned. After hanging up, I immediately called Richard Hoffman to update him on this development. He advised me to wear a recording device to the meeting and to avoid agreeing to any medical evaluations or legal documents, no matter how reasonable they made them sound. The days leading up to Saturday crawled by with agonizing slowness. I found myself rehearsing responses to various scenarios they might present, trying to strike the right balance between seeming cooperative and protecting my interests. I also spent considerable time preparing for what I suspected would be the most important conversation of my life. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. I was reading on my front porch when Dr. Martinez's car pulled into my driveway. My stomach dropped as I realized that David and Amanda had already begun implementing their plan to involve my physician in their scheme. Dr. Martinez walked up my front steps with the careful expression of someone who'd been given concerning information about a patient. "Hello, Maggie. I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I wanted to check in with you about some concerns your family has raised." I invited him in and offered him coffee, all while my mind raced through the implications of this visit. As we settled in my living room, Dr. Martinez opened a folder and pulled out what appeared to be notes from a recent conversation. "David and Amanda came to see me yesterday," he began gently. "They're worried about some changes they've observed in your hearing and overall cognitive function. They mentioned that you've been having difficulty following conversations, missing important phone calls, and seeming confused during family gatherings." I listened to this recitation of fabricated symptoms with growing anger, but I kept my expression neutral and concerned. "I haven't noticed any problems, doctor. I feel like myself." "Sometimes patients aren't aware of gradual changes," he said kindly. "Your family mentioned that you might not realize the extent of the difficulties you've been experiencing. They're particularly concerned about your safety living alone." "What kind of evaluation are they suggesting?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "They'd like me to conduct a comprehensive assessment of your hearing and cognitive abilities. It would involve some tests here in the office, and possibly a referral to a specialist for more detailed evaluation. The goal would be to determine what level of support you might need going forward." Dr. Martinez was clearly acting in what he believed were my best interests, but he was basing his recommendations on completely false information provided by my family. The ethical complexity of the situation struck me forcefully. My doctor was trying to help me based on lies, while my family was lying to him in service of their own financial interests. "Doctor, what would happen with the results of these tests?" I asked carefully. "Well, if we do find significant hearing loss or cognitive decline, there are many interventions that can help. Hearing aids, cognitive therapy, family support systems. The important thing is making sure you have the assistance you need to remain safe and independent for as long as possible." And if the test showed that I needed more help than I could manage on my own? Dr. Martinez shifted slightly in his chair. In some cases, families do need to consider alternative living arrangements or legal guardianship to ensure a loved one's well-being. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The first step would be the evaluation. I realized that Dr. Martinez had been primed not just to conduct tests, but to potentially provide the medical documentation David and Amanda needed for their guardianship proceedings. They had manipulated him into becoming an unwitting participant in their fraud. I appreciate your concern, I said finally. Could I have some time to think about it? This is all quite overwhelming. Of course. But Maggie, I do hope you'll seriously consider the evaluation. Your family loves you very much, and they're genuinely worried about your well-being. After Dr. Martinez left, I sat in my living room feeling a complex mix of emotions. Anger at my family's manipulation, sadness about the betrayal, but also a growing determination to expose their scheme before it could succeed. I called Richard Hoffman immediately and described the doctor's visit in detail. This actually works. In our favor, Richard said after I finished. The fact that they're pressuring your doctor to provide medical evidence based on false information could constitute medical fraud. We need to document everything about this interaction. Should I go through with the evaluation? Absolutely. But on your terms, not theirs. We'll arrange for an independent medical evaluation with specialists who haven't been influenced by your family's false claims. When their fraudulent medical evidence is compared to legitimate test results, their entire case will collapse. Saturday arrived gray and drizzly, matching my mood as I prepared for the family meeting. I dressed carefully in a navy sweater and slacks, wanting to project competence and dignity. The small recording device Richard had given me was secured in my jacket pocket, and I'd practiced activating it discreetly. I arrived at David and Amanda's house precisely at 2 o'clock, carrying a bouquet of flowers from my garden as a peace offering. Emma and Jake were nowhere to be seen, which confirmed that this was meant to be an adults-only conversation. "Mom, you look wonderful," David said as he hugged me, but his embrace felt stiff and performative. Amanda offered me tea and guided me to their formal living room, the one they used for important occasions and difficult conversations. We spent the first few minutes on small talk about the weather and neighborhood news, but I could feel the tension building as they prepared to launch into their prepared presentation. Finally, David cleared his throat in that way that signaled a transition to serious topics. "Mom, Amanda and I asked you here today because we've been concerned about some changes we've noticed lately," he began, his voice gentle but determined. "We love you so much, and we want to make sure you're getting all the support you need." I activated the recording device discreetly and settled back in my chair. "What kind of changes, sweetheart?" Amanda leaned forward, her expression carefully composed into concern. "We've noticed that you seem to be having more difficulty hearing conversations, especially in group settings or when there's background noise. And sometimes you seem confused about what's being discussed." "I haven't noticed any problems," I replied truthfully. "I feel like I'm managing everything just fine." "That's actually part of what worries us," David said. "Sometimes people don't realize when their abilities are declining. It's a natural part of aging, and there's no shame in needing help." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with David and Amanda presenting their case with the smooth efficiency of a well-rehearsed presentation. They cited specific incidents where they claimed I'd misheard instructions or seemed confused by conversations. They mentioned neighbors who had expressed concern about my well-being. They painted a picture of a woman in gradual but unmistakable decline, someone who needed protection from her own diminishing capabilities. What struck me most was how sincere they sounded. If I hadn't known the truth about my hearing, if I hadn't overheard their conversations about legal strategies and asset protection, I might have been convinced by their performance. They had crafted a narrative that was internally consistent and delivered with apparent genuine concern. "We think it would be helpful for you to have some professional evaluations," Amanda said as they moved toward their conclusion. "Dr. Martinez has offered to conduct a comprehensive assessment of your hearing and cognitive function. And depending on what those tests show," David added, "we might need to consider some additional support systems. Maybe someone to help with finances and important decisions. We just want to make sure you're safe and well cared for." There it was. The suggestion of guardianship, presented as a loving family's concern for my welfare rather than what it actually was, a calculated grab for control of my assets. "What would that kind of support look like?" I asked, playing my role as the confused elderly mother. "Well, it might mean having someone help manage your finances," Amanda explained. "Making sure bills are paid on time, that your investments are properly managed, that kind of thing. And possibly looking into a living situation where you'd have more day-to-day assistance." "You mean like assisted living?" "Eventually, perhaps," David said carefully. But first we'd want to get a clear picture of your current abilities and needs. The medical evaluation would help us understand what level of care would be most appropriate. I sat quietly for several minutes, letting them think I was processing their recommendations with the slow deliberation of someone whose cognitive abilities were questionable. In reality, I was marveling at the sophistication of their manipulation. They had presented guardianship and asset seizure as medical necessity and family love. I suppose it wouldn't hurt to have Dr. Martinez take a look, I said finally, knowing that agreeing to an evaluation would buy me time while I prepared my counter-strategy. The relief on their faces was palpable. They had expected more resistance, and my apparent cooperation seemed to validate their approach. "That's wonderful, Mom," David said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "We'll set up the appointment with Dr. Martinez for next week. And in the meantime, maybe Amanda could help you organize some of your important papers. You know, just to make sure everything is in order." Another piece of their plan: getting access to my financial documents under the guise of helping me get organized. I agreed to this as well, knowing that I would control exactly what Amanda was allowed to see. As the meeting wound down, I found myself studying these two people who had raised families with me, shared holidays and celebrations, and now sat planning my legal and financial destruction with smiles on their faces. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could people who claimed to love me be so willing to destroy my autonomy based on lies? I drove home through the darkening afternoon with my mind spinning through everything I'd heard and recorded. The conversation had confirmed every element of their plan: fake medical evidence, manipulated doctor evaluations, forced guardianship, asset seizure, and eventual institutionalization. But it had also given me something invaluable: a complete recording of them presenting their fraudulent case in their own words. That evening, I transcribed the entire conversation and emailed it to Richard along with the audio file. Then I sat down at my kitchen table and wrote out a detailed timeline of everything that had transpired since the initial misunderstanding about my hearing. The pattern of deception and manipulation was clear when laid out chronologically, and I realized that I had been documenting their fraud almost from the beginning without realizing it. The next morning brought a phone call from Amanda, ostensibly to check on how I was feeling after our emotional conversation the day before. But her real purpose became clear when she asked if she could come over that afternoon to help me organize my important documents. "That's so thoughtful of you, dear," I replied. "I've been meaning to get my papers in better order." What Amanda didn't know was that I had already moved all of my truly important documents to a safety deposit box at a different bank than the one where David and Amanda knew I maintained my primary accounts. The papers I would show her were carefully selected copies and outdated documents that would give her the illusion of access without revealing anything crucial about my actual financial situation. When Amanda arrived that afternoon, she brought a legal-sized folder and a notepad, clearly intending to make detailed records of everything she found. I played the role of the grateful but slightly confused mother, occasionally asking her to repeat instructions or seeming unsure about the significance of various documents. "Oh my, I have so many papers," I said, gesturing vaguely at the stack of carefully curated documents I'd prepared. "I'm not even sure what half of them are for anymore." Amanda's eyes lit up at this admission of confusion. She made notes about my apparent inability to understand my own financial documents, comments that I knew would later be presented as evidence of cognitive decline. As she worked through the papers, asking questions about bank accounts, insurance policies, and property deeds, I provided answers that were technically truthful but incomplete. Yes, I had accounts at First National Bank. No, I didn't remember the exact balances. Yes, I owned my house outright. No, I wasn't sure about current property values. What I didn't mention was the substantial account I'd opened at Pacific Credit Union, the investment portfolio I'd moved to a different firm, or the updated will I'd filed with Richard Hoffman that explicitly protected my assets from fraudulent guardianship proceedings. Amanda spent 2 hours creating what she believed was a comprehensive inventory of my financial situation. In reality, she was documenting less than 30% of my actual assets, and none of the protections I'd put in place since discovering their scheme. "This is really helpful, Maggie," she said as she prepared to leave. "It'll make everything much easier when we need to help you manage things." After she left, I called Richard to report on this latest development. He was particularly interested in Amanda's note-taking and her comments about my supposed confusion regarding my own documents. "She's building a paper trail to support their incompetency claims," he explained. "But the fact that you were able to selectively control what she saw while appearing cooperative actually demonstrates significant cognitive ability. We can use her own documentation against her if it comes to a court proceeding." That night, as I reviewed everything that had happened over the past week, I realized that I had reached a turning point. I was no longer simply defending myself against their scheme, I was actively gathering evidence to expose their fraud. The hunter had become the hunted, though they didn't know it yet. The medical evaluation was scheduled for Thursday, and I knew that would be their next major push for evidence to support their guardianship petition. But I was ready for that too. Richard had arranged for me to undergo independent testing with specialists who had no connection to Dr. Martinez or my family. By the time I sat for their manipulated evaluation, I would have legitimate medical documentation proving my complete competence. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself thinking about the strange journey I'd taken from accidentally pretending to have hearing loss to deliberately using that pretense to expose my family's betrayal. In trying to manipulate me, they had taught me how powerful information could be when the other side didn't know you had it. Tomorrow I would continue playing the role of the confused, hearing-impaired grandmother they expected me to be. But behind that performance, I was orchestrating a defense that would not only protect my assets and autonomy but expose their fraud in a way that would have lasting consequences for their own reputations and legal standing. They thought they were caring for a vulnerable old woman who couldn't hear well enough to understand what was happening to her. What they were actually doing was confiding their criminal plans to someone who was recording every word and building a case that would destroy their scheme completely. The irony was almost perfect. In assuming I couldn't hear them, they had told me everything I needed to hear to defeat them. The appointment with Dr. Martinez was scheduled for Thursday morning at 9:30, but I had my own medical appointments arranged for Tuesday and Wednesday. Richard had connected me with Dr. Elizabeth Chen at Seattle Medical Center, a specialist in geriatric audiology who had no prior relationship with my family or Dr. Martinez. She also arranged for me to see Dr. James Morrison, a neuropsychologist, who specialized in cognitive assessments for older adults. Tuesday morning, I drove to Seattle feeling more nervous than I had expected. Not because I was worried about the test results, but because I was taking the first concrete step in what felt like preparing for war against my own family. The medical center was one of those gleaming modern facilities that projected competence and cutting-edge technology from every surface. Dr. Chen turned out to be a woman about my daughter's age, with kind eyes and the sort of professional warmth that immediately put patients at ease. She spent nearly 30 minutes just talking with me about my medical history, my current lifestyle, and the concerns that had prompted the evaluation. "Mrs. Chen, I want to be completely transparent about why I'm here," I said after we'd covered the standard questions. "My family believes I'm experiencing significant hearing loss that's affecting my cognitive abilities and decision-making capacity. They're pressing for medical documentation to support their concerns, and I need independent verification of my actual hearing status." Dr. Chen's expression shifted slightly, and I could see her processing the implications of what I'd just told her. "Are you experiencing any hearing difficulties yourself?" "None whatsoever. My hearing feels completely normal to me, which is why I want objective testing from someone who hasn't been influenced by my family's claims." The testing process was thorough and exhausting. Dr. Chen put me through every conceivable hearing assessment, pure tone audiometry, speech recognition tests, tympanometry, acoustic reflex testing, and several others I'd never heard of. She tested my ability to process speech in noisy environments, to distinguish between similar sounds, and to follow complex auditory instructions. After 3 hours of testing, Dr. Chen compiled the results with the methodical precision of someone who understood the stakes involved. When she finally sat down to discuss her findings, her expression was serious but reassuring. "Mrs. Chen, your hearing is not only normal for your age, it's actually exceptional. You scored in the 95th percentile across all frequency ranges, and your speech processing abilities are outstanding. There is absolutely no medical evidence of hearing impairment or auditory processing dysfunction." She handed me a comprehensive written report that documented every test result in detail. "I'm also including my professional opinion that you show no signs of cognitive decline related to hearing loss, and that your auditory processing abilities are more than adequate for all normal life activities, including managing complex financial and legal matters." Wednesday's appointment with Dr. Morrison followed a similar pattern, but focused on cognitive rather than auditory function. He administered a battery of tests designed to assess memory, reasoning, executive function, language skills, and decision-making capacity. The testing took most of the afternoon and covered everything from simple recall tasks to complex problem-solving scenarios. Dr. Morrison's conclusions were equally definitive. "Mrs. Chen, your cognitive function is excellent across all domains. Your memory, reasoning, and decision-making abilities are well within normal ranges for your age group, and in many areas, you're performing significantly above average. There is no medical basis for concerns about your mental competency or your ability to manage your own affairs. Armed with these two comprehensive medical evaluations, I felt ready to face whatever Dr. Martinez and my family had planned for. Thursday. But Richard had suggested one additional step that would provide even more protection: having a witness present during my evaluation with Dr. Martinez. I called my friend Helen Morrison, a retired nurse who had worked in geriatrics for 30 years. Helen had sharp instincts for medical manipulation and had agreed to accompany me to the appointment as an advocate. Her presence would serve two purposes: she could observe any inappropriate influence or leading questions from Dr. Martinez, and she could provide testimony about my behavior and responses during the evaluation. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid, typical Pacific Northwest weather that matched my mood as I prepared for what I expected to be a pivotal confrontation. Helen picked me up at 8:30, and we drove to Dr. Martinez's office in relative silence, both of us understanding the gravity of what we were about to witness. Dr. Martinez's waiting room was familiar territory, decorated with the same generic landscape prints and aging magazines that had been there for years. When we were called back to his office, I introduced Helen as my friend and advocate, explaining that I wanted someone present for moral support during what my family had described as an important evaluation. Dr. Martinez seemed slightly uncomfortable with Helen's presence, but he couldn't refuse without appearing unreasonable. He began the appointment by reviewing the concerns David and Amanda had raised, reading from notes that clearly came from their conversation with him earlier in the week. Your family has reported several incidents of hearing loss affecting your daily activities, he said, consulting his paperwork. They mentioned that you failed to hear a smoke alarm, that you frequently ask people to repeat themselves, and that you seem confused during family conversations. I listened to this recitation of fabricated symptoms with growing anger, but I maintained my composure. Doctor, I haven't noticed any of these problems myself. Could you test my hearing to determine if there's actually an issue? Well, that's what we're here for, he said, but his response felt perfunctory, as if the conclusion had already been reached and the testing was merely a formality. The hearing test Dr. Martinez administered was basic compared to what I'd undergone at Seattle Medical Center. A simple audiometer test, some speech recognition exercises, and a few questions about my ability to follow conversations. The entire process took less than 30 minutes, which struck both Helen and me as superficial given the serious claims being made about my hearing. What was most telling was how Dr. Martinez interpreted the results. Despite the fact that I had clearly heard every test tone and correctly repeated every word in the speech recognition test, he seemed determined to find evidence of impairment. Well, Mrs. Chen, there does seem to be some mild hearing loss in the higher frequency ranges, he said, studying the audiometer printout with what appeared to be deliberate misinterpretation. Helen leaned forward in her chair. Doctor, could you show us specifically where you're seeing hearing loss? The test results look normal to me. Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable with Helen's direct question. There are subtle changes that might not be apparent to non-specialists. The important thing is that Mrs. Chen's family has observed functional hearing difficulties in real-world situations. But shouldn't the objective test results take precedence over subjective family observations? Helen pressed. Not necessarily. Sometimes patients perform better in controlled testing environments than they do in daily life. The family's observations about confused behavior and missed auditory cues are clinically significant. I watched this exchange with fascination and horror. Dr. Martinez was essentially dismissing objective medical evidence in favor of unverified family claims. Whether he was being deliberately deceptive or had been so thoroughly convinced by David and Amanda's performance that he was unconsciously biasing his interpretation, the result was the same: he was preparing to provide false medical documentation to support their guardianship case. Doctor, what would you recommend based on these findings? I asked, curious to see how far he would go in supporting my family's agenda. I think we need to consider the broader picture of your functional abilities, he said carefully. Your family is concerned about your safety living independently, and there may be some cognitive changes related to your hearing difficulties. I'd recommend a comprehensive geriatric assessment, and your family might want to consider additional support systems to help you manage daily activities. There it was. Despite test results that showed normal hearing, Dr. Martinez was recommending exactly what David and Amanda had requested: medical support for their claims that I needed supervised care and assistance with decision-making. After we left Dr. Martinez's office, Helen was visibly angry. Maggie, what I just witnessed was medical malpractice. That man ignored clear test results in favor of unsubstantiated family claims. He's either incompetent or complicit in what amounts to medical fraud. Helen's assessment confirmed what I had suspected. Dr. Martinez had been manipulated into becoming an active participant in my family's scheme, whether consciously or unconsciously. His willingness to dismiss objective evidence in favor of family testimony meant that I couldn't trust him to provide accurate medical care going forward. That afternoon, I met with Richard to review all the medical evidence we had gathered. The contrast between Dr. Martinez's superficial evaluation and the comprehensive testing I'd undergone independently was stark. Any judge comparing the two sets of results would immediately see that something was wrong with Dr. Martinez's assessment. This is actually perfect for our case, Richard explained. We now have clear evidence of medical manipulation. Dr. Martinez's report contradicts objective test results from qualified specialists, and we have a witness who observed him dismissing evidence that didn't support his predetermined conclusion. What's our next step? We wait for them to make their move. Based on what you've recorded, they're planning to file for guardianship once they have Dr. Martinez's report. When they do, we'll be ready with evidence that will not only defeat their petition but potentially result in criminal charges for fraud. Richard's confidence was reassuring, but I still felt anxious about the waiting period. David and Amanda believed they were close to achieving their goal, and I worried about what they might do if they sensed any resistance from me. I didn't have to wait long. Friday afternoon, David called to check on how my medical evaluation had gone. I could hear the anticipation in his voice as he fished for information about Dr. Martinez's findings. The doctor ran some tests, I said vaguely. He seemed concerned about a few things. What kind of concerns, Mom? Oh, I'm not sure I understood everything he said. Something about my hearing and maybe needing some help with things. He mentioned talking to you and Amanda about it. David's relief was audible. That's okay, Mom. We'll handle all of that. The important thing is that you're getting the care you need. Saturday brought another family dinner invitation, but this time the tone was different. Amanda's voice carried a note of urgency when she called, and she mentioned that they had some important information to share with me about my medical evaluation. I arrived at their house that evening carrying a small gift for Emma, who had a piano recital the following week. The normal family dinner routine felt surreal knowing that David and Amanda were preparing to use fabricated medical evidence to destroy my independence. Emma played a piece she'd been practicing on their living room piano, and for a few minutes, I was able to forget about the legal machinations swirling around me and simply enjoy my granddaughter's accomplishment. Jake showed me a school project about weather patterns, and I helped him understand some concepts about atmospheric pressure. These normal grandparent activities felt precious knowing that David and Amanda were planning to remove me from my grandchildren's lives. After dinner, David and Amanda asked to speak with me privately in their study. The room felt formal and intimidating, with its dark wood furniture and shelves lined with legal and business books. Amanda had prepared a folder of documents, and David's expression carried the gravity of someone about to deliver serious news. Mom, we've received Dr. Martinez's report about your evaluation, David began. Unfortunately, it confirms some of the concerns we've been having about your hearing and cognitive function. Amanda opened her folder and pulled out what appeared to be an official medical report. The doctor found evidence of significant hearing loss that's affecting your ability to process information and make sound decisions. He's recommended immediate intervention to ensure your safety. I read through Dr. Martinez's report with growing amazement at its creative interpretation of the test results. He had somehow transformed my normal hearing into moderate to severe high-frequency hearing loss, and had attributed a range of cognitive symptoms to this fabricated condition. The report concluded with a recommendation for supervised living arrangements and assistance with financial decision-making. This seems very serious, I said, playing the role of the concerned but confused patient. What does it mean for me? It means we need to make sure you have proper support, David explained. We've been consulting with an attorney about the best way to protect your interests and ensure you receive appropriate care. Amanda leaned forward with practiced sympathy. We think it would be best if David and I were appointed as your guardians. That way, we can help you manage your finances, healthcare decisions, and living arrangements. We'd be able to make sure you're safe and well cared for. There it was. The culmination of their months-long campaign of deception and manipulation. They were using falsified medical evidence to justify stripping me of my legal rights and gaining control of my assets. What would that involve exactly? I asked. Well, we'd help you sell your house and move into a lovely assisted living facility we've found, Amanda explained. It's a beautiful place with wonderful staff and lots of activities. You'd have your own apartment, but there would be people available to help you with daily tasks and medical needs. And we'd manage your finances to make sure your care is properly funded, David added. The proceeds from selling your house, plus your retirement savings, should provide for excellent care for many years. I sat quietly for several minutes, letting them believe I was processing this information with the slow comprehension of someone whose cognitive abilities were declining. In reality, I was marveling at the completeness of their plan. They had fabricated medical evidence, manipulated my doctor, researched living facilities, and calculated my net worth. They had thought of everything except the possibility that their victim might be fully aware of what they were doing. "This is a lot to take in," I said finally. "Could I have some time to think about it?" David and Amanda exchanged glances, and I could see their concern that I might resist their carefully laid plans. "Of course, Mom," David said. But Dr. Martinez emphasized that time is important. "The longer you live alone without proper support, the greater the risk to your safety and well-being. The attorney has prepared all the necessary paperwork," Amanda added. "We could take care of everything within a few weeks if you're comfortable moving forward." They were pushing for a quick resolution, probably hoping to complete the guardianship process before I had time to seek independent advice or realize the full implications of what they were proposing. "I understand your urgency," I replied. "Could I meet with this attorney myself? I'd feel more comfortable if I understood all the legal details." Again, they exchanged glances. Having me meet directly with their lawyer wasn't part of their plan, but they couldn't refuse without appearing unreasonable. "Of course," David said after a pause. "I'll arrange a meeting for early next week." I left their house that evening with a copy of Dr. Martinez's fraudulent medical report and a clear understanding of their timeline. They were planning to move forward with guardianship proceedings within the next few weeks, confident that they had all the evidence they needed to succeed. What they didn't know was that I had spent the past month building a defense that would not only protect me from their scheme but expose their fraud in a way that would have lasting legal consequences for both of them. Sunday night, I called Richard to report on the latest developments and to confirm our strategy for the upcoming attorney meeting. "Let them arrange the meeting," he advised. "We want to see exactly how their lawyer plans to present the case. In the meantime, I'll prepare our countermotion with all the evidence we've gathered. When they file for guardianship, we'll be ready to respond immediately with proof of their fraud." As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. What had started as a simple misunderstanding about my hearing had evolved into a complex legal battle for my freedom and autonomy. My family's greed and manipulation had transformed me from a trusting mother and grandmother into someone capable of strategic deception and legal warfare. The irony wasn't lost on me that in pretending to have hearing loss, I had discovered exactly how much I needed to hear. Every conversation I'd overheard, every recorded discussion, every piece of evidence I'd gathered had been possible only because my family believed I couldn't hear them plotting against me. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as their legal strategy moved forward, but I was no longer the vulnerable victim they thought they were manipulating. I had become something much more dangerous to their plans, a fully competent adult with complete knowledge of their fraudulent scheme and the evidence to expose it. The game was entering its final phase, and they still had no idea that they were playing against someone who had heard every move they'd planned from the very beginning. The meeting with their attorney was scheduled for Tuesday morning at Palmer and Associates, the same law firm Dorothy's grandson had mentioned. Walking into their downtown office felt like entering enemy territory, but I was no longer the confused, vulnerable woman they expected to manipulate. David and Amanda flanked me as we sat across from attorney Marcus Palmer, a man in his 50s with the polished demeanor of someone accustomed to handling delicate family matters. His office walls were lined with law degrees and professional certifications, clearly designed to project authority and trustworthiness. "Mrs. Chen, I understand your family is concerned about your ability to manage your affairs independently," Palmer began, his tone gentle but patronizing. "I want to assure you that guardianship proceedings are designed to protect your interests and ensure you receive proper care." I nodded thoughtfully, maintaining my role as the slightly confused elderly woman. "Could you explain exactly what guardianship would mean for me?" Palmer pulled out a thick folder and began outlining the legal framework they intended to impose. David and Amanda would have complete authority over my financial decisions, medical care, and living arrangements. I would retain some personal autonomy, but all major life choices would require their approval. "The medical evidence clearly indicates that your hearing impairment is affecting your cognitive function," Palmer continued, referencing Dr. Martinez's fabricated report. "In cases like this, family guardianship is often the most compassionate solution." What struck me was how smoothly Palmer presented their case, as if fraudulent medical evidence and asset seizure were routine legal procedures. He had clearly done this before, and I wondered how many other elderly clients had been manipulated through similar schemes. "What happens to my house and savings?" I asked. "Your family would manage those assets to ensure your care is properly funded," Palmer explained. "The house would likely be sold to finance your residence in an appropriate care facility, and your other assets would be invested conservatively to provide for your long-term needs. Amanda leaned forward with practiced concern. We found a beautiful assisted living facility, Maggie. You'd have your own apartment and wonderful care. The staff specializes in residents with hearing impairments. I listened to their presentation with growing amazement at the thoroughness of their deception. They had researched facilities, calculated my net worth, and prepared legal documents all based on a medical condition I didn't have. Their fraud was comprehensive and systematic. This is quite overwhelming, I said finally. Could I have a few days to consider everything? Palmer exchanged glances with David and Amanda. They had expected me to either agree immediately or resist obviously, not request time for deliberation. Of course, Palmer said. But I should mention that Dr. Martinez has recommended expediting the process. He's concerned about your safety living alone with your current level of impairment. How quickly would this need to happen? I asked. We could file the guardianship petition by Friday and have a hearing scheduled within 2 weeks, Palmer replied. Given the medical evidence and family consensus, the court approval should be straightforward. I agreed to give them my decision. By Thursday, knowing that Richard would file our countermotion the moment their fraudulent petition appeared in the court system. As we left Palmer's office, David and Amanda seemed confident that their plan was proceeding smoothly. That afternoon, I met with Richard to finalize our response strategy. He had prepared a comprehensive countermotion that included all the evidence we'd gathered, the recordings of their conversations, the independent medical evaluations proving my competence, documentation of Amanda's asset investigation, and Helen's witness testimony about Dr. Martinez's biased evaluation. When they file on Friday, we'll immediately respond with a motion to dismiss based on fraudulent evidence, Richard explained. We'll also file a complaint with the medical board about Dr. Martinez's conduct and request a criminal investigation into their conspiracy to commit elder fraud. Thursday morning, I called David to inform him of my decision. I could hear the anticipation in his voice as he waited for what he expected to be my agreement to their guardianship plan. I've thought carefully about everything we discussed, I said. I appreciate your concern for my well-being, but I've decided to decline the guardianship arrangement. The silence on David's end lasted several seconds. Mom, I don't think you understand the seriousness of your condition. Dr. Martinez was very clear about the risks of you living alone. I understand his concerns, but I've decided to get a second medical opinion before making any major decisions. About my living situation. Mom, that's not necessary. Dr. Martinez is a respected physician, and his evaluation was very thorough. Nevertheless, I'd like another doctor to review my case. I've already made an appointment for next week. David's voice took on an edge of frustration. Mom, we're trying to help you. Sometimes people with cognitive impairment don't realize they need assistance. I appreciate your concern, David, but I'm not willing to proceed with guardianship at this time. After hanging up, I knew they would accelerate their timeline. Palmer would likely file the guardianship petition immediately, hoping to force the issue before I could obtain contradictory medical evidence. Sure enough, Richard called me Friday afternoon to confirm that Palmer had filed their petition that morning. The court had scheduled a hearing for the following Wednesday, giving us less than a week to present our defense. They're rushing this because they're afraid you'll uncover their fraud, Richard explained. But actually, the accelerated timeline works in our favor. We have all our evidence ready, and they won't have time to prepare for our counterattack. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Martinez appeared at my front door, looking uncomfortable and agitated. I invited him in, curious to see what had prompted this unscheduled house call. Mrs. Chen, I understand you're seeking a second medical opinion, he said without preamble. I want to discuss some concerns about your decision-making process. What kind of concerns, doctor? Your family is worried that your cognitive impairment is affecting your judgment about your own care needs. Sometimes patients with hearing-related cognitive decline don't recognize the severity of their condition. I studied this man who had known me for years, who had treated my minor ailments and routine health maintenance, and who was now actively participating in a fraud against me. Whether he was complicit or simply manipulated, his willingness to ignore objective medical evidence was disturbing. Doctor, do you remember the results of my hearing test in your office? I asked. Yes, and they showed clear evidence of hearing impairment affecting your daily function. Actually, I'd like to review those test results with you. Could you show me specifically where you found evidence of impairment? Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable with my direct question. Mrs. Chen, sometimes the technical details are difficult for patients to understand. The important thing is the overall clinical picture based on your family's observations and my evaluation. But shouldn't objective test results be the primary basis for medical conclusions? Not always. Functional impairment in real-world settings is often more significant than controlled testing might indicate. I realized that Dr. Martinez had fully committed to supporting David and Amanda's narrative, regardless of medical evidence. Whether from incompetence or corruption, he was willing to provide false documentation to support their legal case. Wednesday. Morning arrived gray and rainy, matching my mood as I prepared for what would likely be the most important court hearing of my life. Richard met me at the courthouse, carrying boxes of evidence and wearing the confident expression of an attorney who knew he held winning cards. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with worn wooden benches and fluorescent lighting that gave everyone a slightly sickly appearance. David and Amanda sat with Palmer at the plaintiff's table, while Richard and I took our position at the defense table. Judge Patricia Williams entered with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to difficult family disputes. She was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and sharp eyes that suggested she had seen every variety of family manipulation over the years. Palmer opened with a polished presentation of their case, describing me as a vulnerable elderly woman whose hearing loss was causing dangerous cognitive decline. He presented Dr. Martinez's report as definitive medical evidence and painted David and Amanda as concerned family members seeking to protect their beloved mother and grandmother. Your Honor, the medical evidence clearly establishes Mrs. Chen's diminished capacity, Palmer argued. Dr. Martinez, a respected physician who has treated Mrs. Chen for years, has documented significant hearing impairment that is affecting her ability to make sound decisions about her safety and welfare. Palmer called Dr. Martinez as his first witness. Under oath, Martinez repeated his conclusions about my supposed hearing loss and cognitive decline, presenting his fabricated findings as legitimate medical evidence. Richard's cross-examination was devastating. He methodically exposed the superficial nature of Martinez's evaluation, the contradiction between his conclusions and his own test results, and his failure to follow standard diagnostic protocols. For hearing assessment. Dr. Martinez, your audiometry results show normal hearing across all frequency ranges, correct? Richard asked. Well, there were some subtle changes that might not be apparent to non-specialists. Please show the court exactly where in these test results you found evidence of hearing impairment. Martinez fumbled with the charts, unable to point to any objective evidence supporting his conclusions. Under Richard's persistent questioning, it became clear that Martinez had reached his diagnosis based entirely on family testimony rather than medical evidence. When it was our turn to present evidence, Richard called Dr. Chen from Seattle Medical Center as our first witness. Her testimony was precise and unequivocal. My hearing was not only normal but exceptional for my age, and there was no medical basis for claims of cognitive decline. Dr. Morrison followed with equally definitive testimony about my cognitive abilities. His comprehensive evaluation had found me fully competent across all domains of mental function. Then Richard played the recordings. The courtroom fell silent as David and Amanda's voices filled the air, discussing their plan to fabricate medical evidence, manipulate legal proceedings, and seize control of my assets. Amanda's voice was clearly audible. If we can establish a pattern of cognitive decline related to her hearing loss, it'll be easier to get a judge to grant us conservatorship. David's response was equally damning. The lawyer said the key is documentation. We need to start keeping a record of every time she doesn't hear something important, every time she seems confused about what's being said. Palmer's face went pale as he realized his clients had recorded themselves discussing fraud. David and Amanda sat frozen, apparently unable to believe their own words were being played back in open court. Richard called Helen as our final witness. Her testimony about observing Dr. Martinez dismiss objective test results in favor of family claims added another layer of evidence about the systematic nature of their fraud. When Richard finished presenting our case, Judge Williams called a brief recess. David and Amanda huddled with Palmer, their whispered conversation growing increasingly agitated as they realized the magnitude of their exposure. Judge Williams returned with a decision that was swift and unequivocal. She denied the guardianship petition in its entirety, finding that it was based on fraudulent medical evidence and fabricated claims about my competency. This court finds that the petitioners have attempted to manipulate legal proceedings through false medical testimony and manufactured evidence, Judge Williams stated. Mrs. Chen has demonstrated complete mental competency, and there is no legitimate basis for guardianship. But Judge Williams wasn't finished. She referred the case to the district attorney for criminal investigation of elder fraud, ordered a medical board review of Dr. Martinez's conduct, and required David and Amanda to pay all legal costs associated with defending against their fraudulent petition. As we left the courthouse, I felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and vindication. I had protected my autonomy and assets, but the cost had been the destruction of my relationship with my son and daughter-in-law. Richard walked me to my car, both of us quiet as we processed what had just occurred. Maggie, you should know that. The district attorney is very interested in this case. David and Amanda could face serious criminal charges. What happens now? I asked. Now you go home and live your life on your own terms. You've proven that age doesn't equal vulnerability, and that families don't always have our best interests at heart. As I drove home through the Seattle traffic, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this point. What had started as an innocent misunderstanding about my hearing had evolved into a battle for my freedom and dignity. My family's attempt to manipulate me had ultimately taught me how strong and resourceful I could be when my independence was threatened. That evening, I called Dorothy to update her on the court proceedings. Her satisfaction with the outcome was obvious, but she also expressed sadness about the family destruction that had resulted. Maggie, I know this was necessary, but it must hurt to lose David and Amanda this way, she said. It does hurt, I admitted. But I've learned that loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to destroy you. Sometimes protecting yourself requires difficult choices. 6 months later, I received a letter from Emma, my granddaughter. She was now 10 years old and had apparently pieced together some of what had happened between her parents and me. Her letter was brief but heartfelt. Grandma, I miss you. I hope we can see each other again soon. I wrote back immediately, explaining that I would always love her and Jake, and that someday when they were older, they would understand why their parents and I had disagreed. I promised to be there for them whenever they needed me, regardless of what their parents had done. The criminal investigation resulted in plea agreements for both David and Amanda. They avoided jail time but were required to pay substantial fines and perform community service. Dr. Martinez lost his medical license and faced his own criminal charges for medical fraud. I continued living in my own home, managing my own affairs, and enjoying the independence my family had tried to steal from me. The book club still met in my living room, I still volunteered at the animal shelter, and I still tended my garden with the same care I'd always given it. But something had changed in me. I was no longer the trusting, accommodating woman who had unconsciously played into other people's expectations. I had learned to listen carefully, question assumptions, and protect myself from those who would exploit kindness for weakness. The irony of my story wasn't lost on me. In pretending to lose my hearing, I had discovered exactly how much I needed to hear. Every conversation I had overheard, every piece of evidence I had gathered, had been possible only because my family believed I couldn't hear them plotting against me. They had assumed that age and supposed disability made me an easy target for manipulation. Instead, they had discovered that underestimating someone can be the most dangerous mistake you can make. I still live in my house in Tacoma, still drive my own car, still make my own decisions about how to spend my time and money. And yes, my hearing remains perfect. I can hear every word that's spoken around me, every plan that's made about me, and every attempt to treat me as less than the fully competent adult I am. That's a lesson my family learned the hard way, and one I'll never forget. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.